Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Sparks. I'm the president for the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and I am so pleased to welcome you here this evening to the Great Hall for what I know will be a fascinating conversation. If you are new to the Cooper Union, we are a small college with a monumental mission, really founded on the belief that free and fair access to education for all is key to a vibrant democracy. Our academic programs in architecture, art, and in engineering rank among the very best in the nation, and from Cooper's founding more than 163 years ago, this Great Hall stage has offered a New York City forum for influential and everyday voices to participate in the important conversations and debates of our time. Through free public programs like this one that we're gathered here for tonight, the Cooper Union remains a destination for championing public accountability and transparency, for stewarding American democracy, and for bettering our shared experiences as part of that democracy. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by an award-winning journalist whose incisive reporting and commentary reflects a career spanning devotion to those same principles. I'm thrilled to introduce her this evening. Over her 4 decades of working in newsrooms, big and small, Margaret Sullivan has become a trusted champion and critic of the American news media. She began her career at the Buffalo News, where she rose from summer intern to the paper's first woman editor-in-chief. In 2012, she was appointed as the public editor of the New York Times, the first woman to hold that important position as well. As public editor, she was in the unique position of acting on behalf of readers to weigh the actions and reportings of the paper's staff, parsing potential lapses in judgment, unethical practices, thorny journalistic issues. In 2016, having served the longest tenure of anyone to hold that position, she left the Times for the Washington Post, where she had a front row seat to the Trump administration and its impact on American media and politics. In 2020, she was awarded the Mirror Award from Syracuse University for her commentary on the media coverage of Donald Trump's first impeachment. She has also served as a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board and was twice elected as a director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. She won the 2021 Bart Richards Award for media criticism for her Washington Post column, with the judges saying her work, quote, sets the standard for American media criticism. This summer, Margaret announced her retirement from the Washington Post. She continues teaching as a faculty member of the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She is also the author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. In her new memoir, Newsroom Confidential, she traces her life in journalism, chronicling her years battling sexism in highly competitive newsrooms and following the steady erosion of trust in the mainstream press. Joining Margaret Sullivan in conversation tonight is Molly Jong-Fast, a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the author of its newsletter, Wait, What? Molly is also the host of the Daily Beast podcast, The New Abnormal, and is a columnist for Vogue. She previously worked as an editor at large at the Daily Beast and is the author of 2 novels, Normal Girl and The Social Climber's Handbook, as well as a memoir titled Girl Maladjusted. I am just so thrilled to have these 2 incredible women with us this evening. I want to thank our friends and our neighbor at the Strand Bookstore for partnering with us on this event. We're always so grateful to work with them on bringing free public programs to the Great Hall. The Strand will be selling copies of Newsroom Confidential after the event, so please remember to stick around. And now please join me in welcoming Margaret Sullivan and Molly Jong-Fast.
To be here. We made Margaret bring a book. She's going to show it. She's like the least self-promoting person in America, so this is torture for her. So just appreciate that.
But a fun kind of torture.
A fun kind of
yes.
torture. I just want to clear up. I have a new podcast. Is this bad? This is kind of tacky.
No, I think it's important.
But it's tacky, but it's good
it's
for the brand.
It's fact-checking.
Okay, so I have a new podcast called Fast Politics Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Find it wherever you find your podcasts. Okay. I promise that's the only self-promotion I will get tonight. Now we will promote Margaret. I am so honored that I beat out Ben Smith for this. No, just kidding. Don't tell Ben that I beat him out. Maybe, he wasn't free. But I'm so honored to get to do this. Margaret is, I think of as like one of the people that I would like to be if I ever grow up. And I'm just so excited. So I'm going to ask her a lot of questions. I wanted to do some audience questions, but I was told that they don't do that here. So I have tweeted out, and if you have your phone and you want to get on it and annoy the people around you and write a question on my tweet, I will read that unless it's a death threat or has a lot of profanity.
So you could just tweet at Molly
Yeah,
Jong-Fast.
tweet at me and I will read it on the stage unless it's really bad.
Right.
And even then, maybe.
Okay.
But anyway, so I'm so excited to talk to Margaret, and I was hoping that first we could talk a little bit, just the standard, like, why did you decide to write this book question?
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out. This is such an amazing place to be. Well, I wrote the book because I wrote a book 2 years ago, and it was fun. I found out that when you write a book, you become an instant expert. Like, the book was about the demise or the decline of local newspapers, basically, or local journalism. And I was a big expert on that before. But after I wrote the book, it's like, oh, you've written a book about this subject. So I liked that, and that was fun. So that, then it kind of whet my appetite and I thought, well, what else could I possibly write a book about that, it's good to write about things that you either know or can go find out. And I thought that I had a story to tell about my career because it has sort of three interesting parts to it. The becoming the top editor of my hometown paper after many years there, being the public editor of the New York Times, which is a weird and tension-filled job, so I thought that was interesting. And, of course, coming to the Washington Post, the heart of national political reporting, just as Trump was coming on, and sort of seeing that whole thing happening. So I figured there was enough meat there for a good book.
So I may have interviewed you earlier today.
Possibly.
And so we were talking about this, and one of the things that Margaret said she wanted to talk about was being a woman in a newsroom. And Margaret you've sort of had the trifecta, right? You led a newsroom, you were a public editor, and you were a media critic. So you've sort of seen all of that. So my question for you, and we were talking about this earlier too, was, there's a feeling, it still seems to me like white men pretty much rule the world. And I am curious a little bit about your experience in these newsrooms and what that was like.
Well, it was very hard to become the first woman editor of this regional newspaper. I mean, there've been a number of editors. They had all been white men. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's but it was, I did have to sort of overcome this idea that the sort of norm would be a white man. And there was a very good candidate in the newsroom who was a deputy managing editor or something like that. Everybody thought, oh, he'd be perfect and he's going to be the guy. And so it was, I really had to, I've tended to campaign for jobs that I wanted. And I'm not ashamed of that, And I did campaign to become first the managing editor and then the editor of the Buffalo News. And, I was lucky that I had a publisher who kind of wanted to do something that looked different but actually wasn't all that different. So I had been there a long time, so I think I was a safe choice, but I also was a woman, so it looked like it was something semi-revolutionary. So it worked for him, it worked for me, and it was all pretty good.
One of the interesting things we talked about was when you're the public editor of the New York Times, and maybe you guys don't know this, and I didn't know this until I read the book, but you don't have an editor. Did you know this?
It's true.
So explain this phenomenon.
Well, so the public editor, you guys probably know this, is an internal critic. It's like an ombudsman. And it's a little bit like being in internal affairs in a police department or an inspector general of a federal agency or something like that. So they want, the Times doesn't have that job anymore. But when they did have it for 10 or so years, they set it up really well. So the person was going to be completely independent. So while I nominally reported to Arthur Sulzberger, Jr., I didn't really, he didn't say, what are you going to write today, and let me read it first. Yeah. It was just, basically did whatever I wanted. It was edited like a copy editor read it. Right. But I didn't have to run it past anyone, and I definitely didn't report up through the newsroom. So when I got there, Jill Abramson was the editor, and then Dean Beckhay was the editor, and I definitely was not telling them, hey, I'm thinking of doing this piece that's going to make you and your staff look really bad. Are you good with that? No, you just went ahead and did it, and then, of course, I talked to people. I tried to always make sure they had their say and be fair. So that's, but it's a very odd phenomenon. And I have to say that Arthur Sulzberger was perfect, pretty much perfect as a, nominal boss, because he gave me complete independence, but he was supportive of the role. And sometimes when I would write a particularly critical post, he would come down from his 13th floor, airy, and come down and say, that was a good one, because he wanted the public editor to be tough. And so that was really great, and I really appreciated it too. It was so important. It was such a hard job that if I hadn't had that kind of support, it would have been even harder, maybe impossible.
So one of the things you talk about in the book is that you never had a comfortable day at work.
True. Here's why. I never had a comfortable day as public editor because if I wasn't being tough on somebody, I felt like I was being kind of a slacker. Or that maybe I was being too nice. And if I was being tough and taking some criticism from readers and, magnifying it or bringing it out, then people were very unhappy. People inside the paper probably were very unhappy with me. So it was either I was tough on myself, why are you not being, hard on anyone today? Or, oh God, everyone's mad at me. So that's why I never had a comfortable day. And, sometimes I would call my eldest brother and say, wow, everybody's so mad at me here. This is terrible. I'm getting all this. And he would say, if everyone really liked you, you would not be doing the job very well.
So let's talk about the Times, because people, when I interviewed her at lunch, people had a lot of Times questions. Mm-hmm. They wanted to know everything about the Times. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about what you think, where you think the Times is right now, and what you've seen in your time being a media critic there.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Okay, so I was trying to get to the question we had before, that woman asked about how the time,
she's disappointed in the paper. It's not what it used to be.
Right, I didn't want to get into that.
Right, no.
We had somebody at lunch who was saying she loved the Times so much, but she was mad, and she was disappointed, and she felt let down, and you had a really interesting answer. And
well,
so
what I would say is that I admire a lot of the journalism at the Times, and it's an incredible institution. It's a huge newsroom, and when I say newsroom, it's not just the people who are a few dozen blocks from here, but people all over the world. Yeah. Huge reporting staff, very high standards, incredible history, great investigations, huge number of Pulitzer Prizes, on and on. And that is all great. And it's a flawed institution. It's made up of human beings. Right. And it gets things wrong sometimes, and there's something about it that maybe is a little resistant to criticism, so there's not a lot maybe of self-correction built in. which is why the public editor job is important.
Will you explain why the Times picked up the public editor job in the first place? Because I think that's a fascinating story.
So this was at a time when, and I guess I'm not sure about the year, maybe 2003 is a good guess, when there'd been a scandal at the New York Times involving a kind of a rogue reporter named Jason Blair, and you might remember this. He plagiarized and he fabricated things, and it was discovered, and the idea was, how could this have happened? Why didn't we hear about, if he'd been writing stories all along, how is it possible that this could have been happening and we didn't know? And they wanted to do something so that there would be a, kind of a stopgap. So there would be, somebody would be hearing about it and doing something about it. And then it was also kind of in the era in which the Times and other major news organizations had reported in a very flawed and wrong way in the run-up to the Iraq War. The whole thing about weapons of mass destruction and anonymously sourced reporting that turned out to be exaggerated, to lack skepticism and all that stuff. So I think those two things together caused the brass at the Times to say, why don't we institute something that's kind of like what other, the Washington Post had an ombudsman, and it wasn't that uncommon. So they started this thing up. And Dan Okrent was the first public editor, and he was a very interesting writer and stylist. And I remember being at the Buffalo News reading his columns and thinking, like, that is a really interesting job. Yeah. And but that's sort of the impetus of it. That's where it came from.
Okay, so tell me the story. This is for my own edification only, but I guess you guys will find it interesting too. Tell us the story of how you campaigned for that job.
Well, I mean, I always thought it was an interesting job. I had been at the Buffalo News for 30 years. My kids were, I was single again. My children were in law school and at NYU in college. So I had, my life was such that I could do something. And I saw on Eric Wemple's blog, so Eric Wemple writes for the Washington Post, and he writes a lot of stuff that, he writes a lot because he writes a blog. And he wrote that Art Brisbane, who was the public editor at the Times, was not coming back. For whatever reason, his contract was up or he was leaving, I can't remember. And I remember reading that and thinking, like, wow, there we go. I'm actually going to do that. And I just started trying to get the job, in any way I could. Calling people I knew who worked there or who knew people there. And they had a very rigorous process, many layers of interviews and all that kind of thing. So, I just went after it. And I had actually done that trying to become editor of the News, too. So I guess I knew how to campaign for a job and get it.
I think I find that useful in my own life. I don't know. But
you have to know what you want.
Right, exactly. And I also think, like, there are, as women, there's a feeling like we should sort of pretend not to be ambitious, or that it's, not
there's
as...
I think there's a lot of resistance to that. It's often, an ambitious woman is seen as sort of not quite appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
And that I think is one of the big problems we're having in the world. So I want to talk about politics too, but I want to just talk a little bit about what you felt. I feel like we should talk about the emails, Hillary's emails. Can we talk about that?
Sure.
You were public editor during the Hillary's email.
During the beginning of it.
And you got complaints and you addressed them. Not complaints towards you, but complaints towards the coverage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, from the beginning of my time at the Times, I thought that the coverage of Hillary Clinton was a little odd because it was 2013 and the election was a long way off. She hadn't announced her candidacy. That wouldn't happen for quite a while. And yet the Times had decided to have a full-time person basically covering Hillary. And, I think one of the effects of that was to sort of build up this idea that she was the only possible candidate for the Democrats. So there was that. And then when the email stuff started to happen, and that was in July of 2015 when the Times broke the first story about the effort to, the sort of effort to get an investigation opened. That ran on the front page, and it just turned into this huge thing. I mean, I'm sure everybody remembers. It was just this hugest story, and not just in the New York Times, but everywhere. And the Times is so influential that it tends to lead the coverage. Right. And so there's a little bit of, wow, if the New York Times is putting this much emphasis on it, this must be a huge story. But of course, it was an important, I don't say for a second that there wasn't a story there. Yeah. There really was. But, I mean, the worst of it came after I had left. Oh, there's one other element here, which is that there was another candidate named Donald Trump. Right. And there were a few things to say about Donald Trump, too. And there was plenty of reporting about Trump in the Times and the Washington Post. I always like to remind people that when they say, why didn't you tell us who Donald Trump was? I mean, I think everybody knew who Donald Trump was. And the Washington Post, just as one example, under Marty Baron, did a book that came out in August of 2016 called Trump Revealed. And, there was no mystery. But, the relationship with Russia, right, and the involvement of Russian operatives trying to influence the election was a huge story that didn't get nearly as much attention as Hillary Clinton's emails. And I think those things don't really measure up properly.
Well, and so this gets to my next question, which is this idea of the mainstream media tries to be fair and whataboutism. Can we talk about that a little bit?
So there's, I think the mainstream media is constantly under attack. Right. And frequently and very effectively under attack from the right. Yes. There's an effort to say, you guys are, the mainstream media are all liberals. You're spouting the Democratic National Committee's talking points. Right. And so because the media wants to come off as fair, it's very important. It's in our, it's a good impulse. Right. There's a tendency to say, well, maybe they're right. And so let's make sure that we're taking everything down the middle. Right. But when you take everything down the middle, that can be problematic because sometimes the two sides are not equal. And so it doesn't make any sense to do that. And so the phrase that you may have heard about that is both sidesing, which, again, both sidesing sounds good because don't you want to hear everybody out? But if you're making things equal that aren't equal, like if you're making, for example, truth and falsehood equal, right, or spouting a bunch of misinformation versus trying to get at something that's factual, and if you take that down the middle, like for example with climate change, right, that's not how it should be done. I mean, sometimes you just have to seek out what's actually true and report that.
I think it took a long time for a lot of mainstream media outlets to say that Trump was lying. Can you talk a little bit about the anxiety around that?
Yeah, there was a real tendency to say, well, we don't want to use that word because if you say something's a lie or if you say someone is a liar, you are in their head. Right. You're saying they meant it. They knew something was false and they said it anyway. So, well, we're not in his head. We should all be glad about that. We're not in Donald Trump's head, and so we can't really say whether he's lying or not. We have to call it a false statement. Right. And, eventually, though, after the 12th time that something's been corrected and it's obviously he's not changing his tune and he's still saying it, then it's probably a lie. And I think we see the same tendency to be careful about words, and I'm not saying this is all bad, with the word racist.
Right.
Like you hear racially tinged, right? Or, racial, there's all different ways to say it. And sometimes something just is racist.
Right.
And I think the media has come a long way with that.
What do you think, now we're like 22 days or 23 days or from the midterms, and I, of course, am completely destroyed by this, But, we're a country kind of on the precipice. A lot of us are holding our breaths. I mean, do you think we've gotten better as media of covering this radicalization in the country, and where can we improve before 24?
So the thing that bothers me the most is that, the Republican Party has been almost taken over by election denialists.
Right.
And people who are not at all willing, they're not even willing to say Joe Biden's the president, the duly elected president. And so, I think it's important to remind people, the audience, the readership, if you're going to quote somebody about some other subject, I think it's important to remind people this is someone who actually tried to overturn the election.
Right.
And there are news organizations that have done that. And there's been a lot of good reporting done on this subject. But in general, this too is sort of false prey to the equalization, the normalization thing. I have to drink some water.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to ask you about one of the things that the things in Margaret's columnist days that really had a big impact on me as a writer, and I'm hoping you'll talk about them, are the first is this truth sandwich.
The truth sandwich.
The truth sandwich?
Yes. So, should I talk about
yeah,
that?
please.
So
or
the,
I can
the
talk about it, but
well,
I think we'd rather hear it from you.
I guess, one of the things that happens with propaganda is that the repetition of lies and the magnification of lies is very bad. And the media tends to do that because they'll take an outrageous statement that's been made by a public official, say the president, and put it in a news alert, a tweet, a headline, a first paragraph, whatever. And that has the effect of repeating the lie and actually driving it into people's minds as possibly, giving credence to it. Yeah. So the truth sandwich idea, which comes from a linguist, George Lakoff, who's I think at Berkeley, is don't do it that way. Don't say, what was one of the big COVID falsehoods?
You could let the light in the body. No,
yes,
I'm
the
sorry.
light in the body. Exactly.
That was when they stopped doing the press conferences. What about that it was going to go away by Easter?
Right, that kind of thing. So, you might see a headline that said, President predicts that COVID is fading and is almost over, or something like that. So the truth sandwich would do it differently. It would state the actual truth.
Right.
The country is on the brink of having whatever number of people dead of COVID. And then say, it's actually not a truth. Unfortunately, it's a misnomer.
Right.
But, oh well. Because the sandwich part of it is
the lie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then put the lie, and here's what is being said that's false, and now we're going to fact check it.
Right.
And unfortunately, that really runs against the whole way news works, because news doesn't do things that way. But I've actually seen stories that use that technique,
right,
and it's effective. But it just cuts against sort of the scoop, mentality of here's the latest crazy thing, and we're going to tell you in a news alert or a tweet, and then, oh yeah, in the 8th paragraph, which no one's ever going to read,
right,
we'll tell you that it's not true.
Right, you have to contextualize the lie.
Exactly.
Another thing, and then what I'm going to do is, because we can't take questions, I'm going to read the questions so that will torture
I think
Margaret
that's fair.
more.
No,
Sorry.
no, I mean, I'm up for that.
So anyway, the thing that I'm really, really struck by, and I talk about all the time and is really in my head, is this idea of pro-democracy journalism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I said that I'm worried that because there's all this election denialism, there's all kinds of efforts to suppress voting, to put people like secretaries of state in who aren't going to do what the Georgia Secretary of State did, which was to stand up and say, no, I cannot find those extra, whatever, 11,000 votes. I don't want to see that eaten away at. And so, so pro-democracy journalism would look at these issues and say, what is the thing? How can we approach these subjects in a way that's going to serve the public and is going to help preserve our democracy? And that can be areas of coverage. It can mean stating things that are true without being afraid of being attacked. And it's sort of a whole mindset.
Yeah, that is so useful to me and interesting. Okay, I'm going to ask now we have a lot of questions,
Okay.
So I'm sorry.
It's this whole audience,
I know,
they're the ones who are
everyone.
tweeting
I
it.
hope that it's all of you tweeting. Now you have to look at me reading my tweets. No one wants that, but all right, here we go. All right, so our first question is, and yes, the dog, for those of you who care, is on. He's doing okay. That
Molly's dog was hit by a
one
car,
of
very
my
unfortunately.
dogs it's always important to have things be as complicated as possible. Okay, so do you think that not-for-profit model could be a solution for the erosion of local journalism? Does taking the financial pressure to turn a profit for owners, investors, allow important coverage to, tell us about that?
I mean, you still have to make money. You still have to, even if you're not going to turn a profit, you still have to pay your reporters. You have to turn the lights on and run the printing presses and do all that kind of stuff. So just saying that you're not going to be for profit doesn't really solve the business model problem, but it can take some of the pressure off. And there is an interesting case study, which is the Salt Lake Tribune turned itself into a, I guess, nonprofit or not-for-profit, and it does, I think, change the focus, which is we're not here to turn a profit, we're here to just make $1 or just break even and serve the public. And that does not mean that there aren't a lot of for-profit news organizations that do a great job with journalism. They do. But yes, of course. But still, you don't want your main focus to be we've got to make money. And as hedge funds buy up lots of local newspapers, and as these chains sort of take over the world, and as cable companies are owned by huge media conglomerates, the profit motive, which says you got to be fast, you've got to be engaging above all, and outrageous above all, that's not good.
Do you believe, this is a really unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I'm ready.
I mean, I would not want to be asked this question. Do you believe America will remain a democracy? Go. No pressure. Tick tock, tick tock. Get going. Come on.
Yes, I do. I think it's threatened, but I think that there are a lot of people who are working hard to make sure that we stay what we are. I mean, I see some sort of creeping authoritarianism that's really worrisome, but I don't think we're about to fall off the cliff anytime soon.
Does corporate media understand the repercussions of their anti-democracy stances? This is like, not quite a question.
Let's go to the next question.
Yes.
I mean, not that I'm afraid to answer it. I just think it's a little I already
bit.
said that stuff.
All right, now we have to go to, hold on, I'm always very prepared for such things. All right, so another question is, do you think that, here we go, feels like there's a real void since you have stopped writing your media column. This is very embarrassing for you, I know.
Yeah.
Who can fill that void? No, I'm just kidding. Can you start writing your media column again?
No,
Thank
I'm
you.
not going to do that. I mean, I got a little burned out, I have to say. I wrote the media column for 6 years, and the whole time it was, the country was obsessed with Trump, and there were sort of two big subjects I was talking about, which was everything that was happening around Trump and COVID and all of that, and also I was writing a lot about the demise of local news. And, neither one of those topics was super cheery or anything. And also, there's a tremendous amount of harassment that was coming my way online, but not just online. Sometimes to my email, sometimes by phone, and in other ways, very misogynistic, very nasty. And it was wearing, and it was draining. So I just thought it might be good to do something else for a while, like write a detective series.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to do that.
That's good.
I just would like to mention that a little bit. I'm workshopping it here a little bit. So the heroine, that's with an E on the end, of my detective series is a laid off local newspaper reporter. And she's in Buffalo, and she's it's good. She's laid off, and she's desperate and doesn't quite know what to do, and she starts turning her investigative skills as a reporter to solving crimes. So she becomes kind of a de facto detective, and her actual name is Geraldine Fusara, but she doesn't like her name because it's not a really mellifluous name, right? And so she decides one day she's in Buffalo and she's watching the snow come in off the lake, which it's almost horizontal. And she gets this idea that she wants her byline to be gale force. So she goes to her editor, a kind of a crusty guy, and she marches over to him and says, "I want my byline to be gale force." And he just sort of looks at her and is like, "Why not just call yourself Lake Effect?" So anyway, I've actually started writing this, and I'm having a blast doing it. And I've been thank you. And I thought it's funny, I can make it funny, and it actually can also get a point across, but that wouldn't be the reason to do it.
No,
So, I don't know, I think I've paid my dues. I've been in journalism for 40 years, and if I want to try something else for a while, I'm sorry, person on Twitter, but I
get it a lot.
I can't
By
do
the way,
it.
Yesterday, Margaret told me she would stop talking to me about this. She said, "Stop nagging me to start writing again."
Well, I'm writing.
Yes, so start to write nonfiction media criticism again. So I have a question here. New York Times has become a much stronger newsroom in the last 10 years.
Much what stronger?
Much stronger. 2,000 journalists, talent, more of a global focus, many, many more bureaus.
Who is this?
Well, no, this is a good question. No, it's gotten bigger.
A.G. signed,
yes,
A.G. Salzberger.
Yes, the Athletic, Wirecutter, is this kind of but it is also and this is, I think, a good question. It's the biggest newspaper, maybe in the world, right? I don't know. In the States, in America.
Yes.
Is this kind of super strong New York Times good for American democracy?
Well,
See,
I
it
think
ends up being
that
a
is
hard question.
No, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think having a robust, successful New York Times is a great thing, and I'm very happy to see them making it work in the digital world, because there was some doubt about whether that was going to happen when all the print advertising went away and there were layoffs and all of that. But they have righted themselves and done it very wisely. If you're not there for the front page stories, you're there for the cooking app, right? And Wordle and all of that. And so that's great. But I don't want to see it be so dominant that it doesn't have competition and that it's the only source of news, because that wouldn't be good.
Okay, now I have a very tricky question. This is actually a good, very tough question.
Okay.
Do you have any public editor ask takes you'd like to share about events? And now we're going to ask you the very, kind of...
Buzzy.
Yeah, Caliphate. You can answer about Caliphate. You can answer about James Bennett, because he was back in the news, because Semaphore, and we love Ben Smith, even though he's not doing this interview. I am. No, don't tell him I said that.
He can never know.
He'd never know. But he had a very, very interesting media column today that had a lot of James Bennett quotes that were pretty spicy. So you have to weigh in on one of those.
Okay, well, that's a lot of inside baseball. I mean, I don't know whether everybody here knows
You
about
wanted
what
to gossip,
Caliphate and James
Do we want
Bennett,
gossip? We want some
all
gossip,
that.
right? Yeah.
I mean,
Little go. Yeah, I'm hearing clapping.
I take these
that was
topics
one
up in my
I'll
book.
take it.
I actually write about Caliphate, which
Yeah.
was the Times podcast that kind of went sideways and, had to be, really they had to pretty much apologize for what was in it. And the whole thing about the James Cotton op-ed that ran and the editor of the opinion
Tom
section.
Cotton. Senator Tom Cotton.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Fact-checking, very important.
That's right.
Tom Cotton's op-ed that said, the headline of which was, "Bring in the troops."
Right. Tom Cotton, who's never seen a war. He didn't want to fight in, but yes.
Well,
anyway, continue.
And then the editor, James Bennett, who had been a revered figure at the Times and elsewhere at the Atlantic, was basically pushed out. And so I guess the question is, was that right?
Well, and also, what was it like being public editor then?
I wasn't there then.
Oh, all right.
But,
Well, then
but
never
I
mind.
can tell you one thing. When things like that would happen with James Bennett or with Caliphate, I was already at the Post, but I would usually go on Twitter and say, it's another great day not to be the public editor of the New York Times. Because, these things just are so magnified. I mean, the place is such a fishbowl, and whatever happens there turns into just a very big deal. The Caliphate stuff was not good. I mean, there needed to be much more skepticism brought to the reporting behind that podcast. And I think everybody, including Rukmini Callimachi and Dean Baquet and everybody involved in it, recognizes that. But what they said about it was, we kind of fell in love with the story,
Right.
and we weren't rigorous enough. The James Bennett thing, I thought that it was, I hope I'm retelling this correctly here, but okay. I think he said that he hadn't read the piece before it ran, and I don't know, when I was the editor of a section or a paper or whatever, I would tell people who worked for me, no surprises, okay? I'd like to see anything that looks like it's going to be a problem. So I think there were some management issues there. I always do wonder if there isn't a way to address these things without, completely, firing somebody.
Right.
Don McNeil, or James Bennett, or, there've been a bunch of these different things. Could there be a way to work it out that is fair and that takes action, but isn't quite so draconian?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that was good. You guys like the inside baseball gossip, right? It was good, right? Yeah, see?
Okay.
I'm just torturing Margaret here.
Margaret, I'm happy to talk about anything anyone wants to talk about.
Let's just go back to the book for another minute, because we're almost out of time. I got the almost out of time sign, which is huge, always a huge relief. I wanted to know, you wrote this book, I always feel like when you write a book, and I haven't written a book in a while, and who even knows if I'll ever write another book, but when you write a book, you sort of, there's some kind of change that happens internally, and you sort of learn things. Because you're looking at your story in a different way. Did you learn anything writing this book?
Well, I had two Post-it notes on my desk or wherever I was writing it that so a friend had said to me, we were just talking about the books we were both writing, Brooke Kroger, actually, of NYU, and she just said to me in passing about what I was doing, she said, "You have to make it gorgeous." So I was like, "I do? I have to make it gorgeous?" So I had that, you have to, in other words, make the writing good and make it sing. So you have to make it gorgeous. And then I'm not sure where this came from, but it's sort of about, I think, boxing. The more you sweat, the less you bleed. And so the idea is, if you work very hard and you get, make sure everything is right as you can make it, and do the research and be rigorous, you will bleed less afterwards. So those were the two things that I tried to keep in mind. And, I don't know, I mean, I kept saying about the book, I just hope it's well received,
So now it's been well received.
And now it's been well received, so I'm happy. It's actually an incredible relief. It's very scary to bring a book out. It's very scary to bring a book out that's about your own life.
Yeah.
And you don't really know how people are going to read it. And so there have been some very kind reviews, and I've been thrilled to have them. And I just hope people enjoy it.
I liked it. I thought it was very good, so I liked it. I had to read it on my phone because I didn't get a printed one, but I thought it was very, very good. Last question, because we're out of time. What can we do better coming into 24?
Well, I mean, I think that I'd like to see all journalists be very intentional about this moment we're at in history, and to say, don't be asleep at the switch. We're at a hinge moment in American history with democracy arguably on the precipice, and we all need to, our business, our craft needs to be at its best right now. And so we shouldn't be doing things to just get clicks, or we shouldn't be doing things to just feed the outrage machine. We should be doing public-spirited journalism that really matters, because it really matters in our world.
That's a good ending. Thank you for joining us.
That was good, Molly. Thank you.